Welcome to our Delaware Riverkeeper Network hydrogen webinar this evening. It's nuke-powered hydrogen. What are the impacts? My name is Tracy Carluccio. I'm Deputy Director of Delaware Riverkeeper Network. And we're looking forward to hearing tonight from our experts. We have Dr. Arjun Makhijani, and we also have Dr. Desmond Kahn. And I'm going to turn it over now to Annika Van Rossum, Advocacy and Program Director for Delaware Riverkeeper Network, to introduce our speakers. Annika?
Hi, everyone. We're so excited to have you all here. So before I get into our speakers, just a quick couple housekeeping things, and then I'll give you their intros. So we have both our speakers here, and we'll have presentations from both of them, which is awesome. And then we're going to give you a little bit of an update on MACH2 at the end. And then at the end is when we'll have time for question and answer. And so our first presenter is Arjun, I'm so bad with names, Arjun Makhijani. So Arjun Makhijani is president of IEER, holds a PhD in engineering from the University of California at Berkeley. He has produced many studies and articles on nuclear fuel cycle related issues, including weapons production, testing, and nuclear waste over the past 20 years. He is the principal author of the first study ever done, completed in 1971, on energy conservation potential in the U.S. economy. And most recently, Dr. Makhijani has authored Carbon-Free and Nuclear-Free, a roadmap for U.S. energy policy, the first analysis of a transition to a U.S. economy based completely on renewable energy without any use of fossil fuels or nuclear power. He is the principal editor of Nuclear Wastelands and the principal author of Mending the Ozone Hole, both published by MIT Press, which is all wonderful. And then our next speaker will be Desmond Kahn, and Desmond Kahn earned a PhD in biological sciences at the University of Delaware, specializing in population ecology and trophic interactions. After teaching at area colleges, he worked for the Maryland Fisheries Service and then for the Delaware Division of Fish and Wildlife, where he is a biometrician. In addition to his analysis for the Division of the impact of the Salem Nuclear Generating Station on the fish populations of the Delaware River and Bay. He researched fishery ecology and participated in marine fishery management, representing Delaware and serving as chair of technical committees of the Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission. He retired from the division after 20 years and is currently an independent researcher and works as a consultant with Fishery Investigations, which he directs. He is a past president of the Northeastern Division of the American Fishery Society. So we have two very wonderful speakers for you tonight with awesome credentials and lots of fantastic knowledge. We are excited to hear from both of them. So with that, I will turn it over to Arjun Makhijani.
I'm so pleased you put me on the same panel as Dr. Kahn. I've never met him. I'm pleased to meet you. I want to talk to you offline. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to talk about a very focused thing, nuclear energy and hydrogen. Hydrogen, lots of hydrogen production methods have been proposed. I'm going to focus on just this one at the request of Delaware Riverkeepers. Next slide. Yeah. So just a little overview about hydrogen and nuclear energy. Hydrogen is not a greenhouse gas, but it does impact global warming because it has chemical reactions in the atmosphere, it gets oxidized, and then it indirectly produces global warming, like by lengthening the lifetime of methane in the atmosphere, by creating water vapor in the stratosphere. So it has a global warming potential of about 33 relative to carbon dioxide on a 20-year. It's not a primary energy source. It's made from other energy sources. So it's like electricity. Electricity is not a primary energy source. It's made from other energy sources. Hydrogen is different in that it's a chemical and you can store it. It has its pluses and minuses. Currently, 95% of the hydrogen in the United States is made from natural gas, also called fossil gas. Hydrogen can be made with zero carbon emissions at the site if the primary energy is zero carbon emissions. Like at the site, nuclear is close to zero carbon, like solar and wind. Of course, life cycle emissions are something else, and I'm not going to get into that today. So does hydrogen produced from zero carbon sources produce CO2 emissions? The answer is yes, if the energy is not what is called additional. That's a technical term that I want to explain in the next slide. Next slide. Okay, so today, almost all the low carbon sources, not all, but essentially all nuclear energy is supplying existing loads, lights, refrigerators, industries, and so on. Nuclear energy plants operate in excess of 90% capacity factor, including the Salem plants, 93.7, as you can see, last 5 years average. So they're already, the low carbon energy they generate already being used. The few percent that they're top the time they're not operating, they're refueling, and it's maintenance time. Sometimes they may have a problem that requires a shutdown. But essentially, they're operating flat out. So now, if you use some of that electricity, say, and I'll give you some numbers, for making hydrogen at the site of Salem or Hope Creek or some other power plant, the loads they're now supplying have to come from someplace else. They're going to come from the electric grid, which does not have zero CO2 emissions. So now you're taking away zero CO2 electricity from the grid, using it for hydrogen, and then supplying those loads with non-zero CO2 energy. And I'll show you how those numbers work. I did some actual numbers for a hydrogen pilot plant. Next slide. There's a hydrogen pilot plant that was supported by the Department of Energy. It's operating at the 9 Mile Point nuclear power plant in New York. It's a small plant, 500 kilograms of hydrogen per day. Takes about 10,000 megawatt hours per year. Just, for reference about what a megawatt hour is, if your typical house might consume a megawatt hour a month, a little bit less, a little bit more. So this 10,000 megawatt hours that is going to the hydrogen plant on site must now be supplied by the New York grid. Now, what part of the New York grid? That's a question. You could say, well, the average electricity supply of New York, that would be 0.2 metric tons per megawatt hour. So you're already talking 2,000 metric tons, as you can see, simple math. But more likely, it's the underused electric generating plants that would be used, and the most sort of capacity available that operates at a lot less than 100% capacity factor is natural gas plants. So you're increasing natural gas plants. 0.81 metric tons per megawatt hour is the New York natural gas average emissions, including methane leaks at the 20-year global warming potential. In New Jersey, that number would be 0.52 because New Jersey's natural gas plants are combined cycle and more efficient than the ones in New York. Next slide. So some charts now. So on-site emissions on the left. So hydrogen production at 9 Mile Point is not producing any emissions at the hydrogen plant because it's at the New York, diverting nuclear energy at the plant site. Now, if you use the New York average grid, 0.2 metric tons per megawatt hour, to supply the loads that are now not being supplied by nuclear, that means 18 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen. On the right, you see, for reference, the emissions from natural gas based hydrogen production today, 14.6 CO2. So now you're aggravating, it's worse than just using natural gas to produce hydrogen. 18.6, and average of New York is quite a low emissions grid because they have lots of hydropower. More typically, you'll be using natural gas to supply that 10,000 megawatt hours. And then now you have 43.4 CO2 equivalent kilograms per kilogram of hydrogen. So you're almost tripling the carbon intensity of hydrogen production, greenhouse gas intensity. Next slide, I've given you some New Jersey numbers. So New Jersey, the difference between the grid supply and the average supply is not very great. So roughly speaking, if you produce hydrogen from the Salem and Hope Creek plants, you're talking about 32 kilograms of hydrogen, of carbon, greenhouse gases per kilogram of hydrogen, compared to natural gas 14.6. So this is the result of not having additionality, not having a dedicated zero carbon source, solar, wind, and I'll come to the new nuclear a little bit later in my talk. So this is absolutely a losing proposition from the basic reason that hydrogen is being advocated, that is for climate reasons. Diverting existing nuclear power should not be permitted, and it does not meet the Department of Energy clean hydrogen standard of CO2 equivalent, 4 kilograms CO2 equivalent. So, you know, about 7-8 times that. If you use non-additional nuclear energy to produce hydrogen in New Jersey. Next slide. I'm almost done. So if if 5% of New Jersey nuclear energy were used for hydrogen production, you're talking 900,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent emissions. There's potential added damage if the hydrogen is not used well, like mixing it in pipelines. Many gas companies are proposing that and supplying it to buildings. And this doesn't account for hydrogen leaks. And so from every point of view, equity, cost, climate, using nuclear energy from existing plants to make hydrogen makes no sense. All right, next slide. What about SMRs? Very briefly, SMRs are, a mirage in the pro-nuclear people's eyes, lots of bipartisan agreement. The most advanced project was NuScale. It was abandoned after its customers abandoned it at $20,000 a kilowatt. By my calculation, $20,000 a kilowatt unsubsidized hydrogen would be well over 10 kilograms, 12, 13, 14, 15 kilograms, dollars per kilogram of hydrogen. The DOE target for economical hydrogen is $1 per kilogram. So 3-4 times the excess CO2 emissions if you use existing power, 10-15 times the cost of the DOE. So in addition to that cost, there's a high opportunity cost. So, we're not overflowing with zero carbon sources. So opportunity cost means what's the best way to use available and new zero carbon sources. So for example, one of the reasons I said blending hydrogen with natural gas and existing pipelines is a poor idea is that if you use the same renewable or nuclear energy to, say, heat homes with efficient heat pumps, you can heat, using hydrogen to blend in natural gas pipelines takes 5 times as much energy as the opportunity cost of using it in heat pumps. So from every point of view, and then of course, small modular reactors aren't going to happen anytime soon. It's kind of, in my opinion, waiting for nuclear Godot. I don't know if you're familiar with that play, Waiting for Godot. 2 guys are waiting for Godot, and they wait, and they wait, and they wait, and they wait. And so that, I believe, brings me to the end of my slides. We produce a book on hydrogen, Tom Hersbach and I. The link is in there for you. Thank you. I'm done. Major concerns on environmental justice, mining, NOx pollution if burned, safety issues at all stages of production, perpetuate fossil fuels if made from them. We're not talking about that today. And indoor air pollution when mixed with natural gas. Thank you. I'm really done now.
All right. I'm going to talk to you about some other impacts of the Salem Nuclear Generating Station in particular that the Delaware Riverkeeper Network has been working to try to reduce. And I've been assisting them to some extent in that work. The Salem Nuclear Generating Station, as Dr. Makhijani mentioned, has been mentioned by the Hydrogen Hub MACH2 planners as a potential component. Now I'm going to talk about its impacts on the fish populations of the Delaware River, Delaware Bay, and the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, next slide, please. All right, we're not certain what the role of Salem reactor would be, if any, because the hub planners have changed their description over time. There's two identical reactors at Salem, Salem 1 and Salem 2. And they originally linked Salem with the Oyster Creek nuclear reactor, which has actually been decommissioned. It's also in South Jersey. So it's unclear how the Oyster Creek plant would work. But anyway, now they're saying that the Hope Creek reactor may be used for the hub instead of the Salem reactor. They're at the same location. They could be used, I believe, as a source of electrical power for electrolysis to produce hydrogen gas, but that is not my area of expertise. Okay, next slide. Okay, Salem went online about 1978. It's located near Salem, New Jersey, on the lower tidal Delaware River. I'm going to move this 10 miles below the mouth of the Chesapeake Delaware Canal. The water is brackish at this point most of the year. It's about a mile above the beginning of the Delaware Bay. And at that time in 1977, 78, I was working as a research biologist with a consulting company named Ichthyological Associates that was hired by the owners of the Salem plant to gather fisheries and other ecological data, which was required by the federal government. And currently, the plant is now owned by both Public Service Electric and Gas, a large New Jersey utility, and Exelon, a large national company. Next slide. Okay, cooling. Nuclear reactor safety, et cetera, is really about cooling to a great extent. They produce very high temperatures in their core with the fuel rods, and they have to be constantly cooled by flowing water. And if they don't have that, the core can melt. And like what happened at 3 Mile Island, the core was halfway melted at the end of that. And this can produce an explosion, such as what happened at Chernobyl and Fukushima. And that would make a large area of land uninhabitable. The first generation of reactors, including Salem, used what's called once-through cooling. That means they pull huge volumes of water through the plant from a water body, cool the core, then release this heated water back into the water body. The newer approach is to recycle the cooling water using what's called a cooling tower. And that reduces water intake by about 95%. That's the case with the Hope Creek reactor. And if you've ever driven in downstate Delaware, you can see this perpetual cloud from the Delaware River, which is the steam coming out of the Hope Creek reactor's cooling tower. Okay, next slide. Now, Salem in particular, when both reactors are operating, it pulls in over 3 billion gallons of water per day. And that is either the largest industrial water intake by volume or one of the largest in the world. Now, when the plant pulls in water, it pulls in fish with the water. And the greater the water volume pulled in, the greater the number of fish pulled in. Now, there are metal screens at the intakes where the water goes into the plant, and larger fish are caught on these screens. Some of them survive that and some don't, but the smaller fish, including especially younger stages such as larvae and early juveniles, are pulled in with the cooling water and killed. Next slide. Okay, numbers of fish killed by Salem. A recent newspaper article describes the estimates of these numbers as, quote, murky, unquote. That is not correct. The federal government requires Salem, the owners, to produce estimates of the numbers killed of roughly 20 important species. And they do that by periodically sampling the water being pulled into the plant and counting the number of fish of different species in that water, as well as taking fish off the screens at the entrance. However, entrainment in general kills approximately 90 to 95% of all fish killed. Impingement is a very minor component. And once they get their counts for their samples, they just expand those numbers to cover the period where they weren't sampling. And we have these estimates from 1907 to 1999, and then from 2000 to 2004, 3 years. These estimates are published by Public Service, Electric and Gas in their permit applications. They compiled one in 1999 for that permit, and then they had another permit due in 2016, or they were issued one. They issued the more recent estimates then. Next slide. Now, I'm only going to have time to talk about a couple of important species here, and one of them is the bay anchovy. This is largely killed by entrainment. They're small fish, a few inches long. They school, and they are so small that even the adults can be pulled through the screens in most cases and killed in entrainment. Now, you see in 78, when the plant started down here on the lower left, the numbers were very large, 10 billion or 5 billion, that type of thing. And that's an immense number of fish killed in a year. However, I think in the early years, the plant was not always running constantly, and they were making adjustments. But by the mid 80s, the 80s, they were really rolling. And you see, they got up to an estimate of 45 billion anchovies. That's one species killed in a year. I'm not aware of any other plant in the world that kills that number of fish of one species, but there may be. I don't have the data. However, you notice as the 90s, the 80s blended into the 90s, these numbers killed went down to levels by 93 or so, about 1 billion fish a year. Now, I showed this to a biologist I know. He said, well, they're doing better. They're not killing as many anchovies. And the reason they're not killing as many anchovies is not because Salem is doing anything different. It's because they've killed so many anchovies, or at least anchovy abundance has declined so much since they started up that there's not enough around to kill 45 billion of them anymore. And I've done independent analysis on the catch per trip of the Delaware Division Fish and Wildlife Research Trawl Survey of bay anchovy, and there is definitely a significant negative trend in abundance over the period from 1980 through, the 2005 and so forth. So I can't prove that this decline is due to the massive kills by Salem, but it's a likely hypothesis. Next slide. Now, bay anchovy is an important fish because of its role in the food chain. It's very small. It feeds on the zooplankton, which are abundant in the estuary. And what they do is by eating zooplankton, they convert them into fish flesh in their own bodies, and then they are eaten by larger piscivores, such as striped bass, weakfish, bluefish, and many other species of fish. So they convert this abundant zooplankton into fish through the food chain. And that's why they have a very important role. Okay, next. And by the fact that their abundance has declined dramatically in the bay since the plant started up, they've reduced overall productivity of the ecosystem there because there's less fish flesh for larger fish to feed on. Okay, next slide. The next species is striped bass. This is the most valuable species produced in the Delaware estuary from a fisheries point of view. And it was restored. The stock was almost extinct in the 20th century due to the fact that there was very little oxygen in the river on the striped bass spawning grounds, which are Wilmington to Philadelphia, all the way up into Philadelphia. But once the Clean Water Act came in, the water was gradually cleaned up to an extent. So by 1989, they seem to have come to more or less full tilt abundance and production of young bass every year. However, the plant kills, in some years, they report hundreds of millions of striped bass. And these are primarily larvae and early juveniles. So hundreds of millions sounds like an immense kill, and it is, but it's not like they're killing hundreds of millions of catchable size striped bass. They're killing primarily the larvae and juveniles. And the thing about these life stages is they have a very low natural survival rate. So if you have, 1 million larvae, maybe 1% of them, for example, could survive to, say, 5 inches long at half a year of age. So it's when you're thinking about these numbers, they're definitely damaging, as I'll show, but they're not the same thing as killing, foot-long striped bass, 1 million of them or so. So what I've done here is an analysis known as equivalent recruits analysis. And what I've done is taken the numbers reported killed and estimated how many of them would have been able to survive to a half year of age. Because at a half year of age, we estimate the abundance of the younger year production for that year. With a state of New Jersey has a beach seine survey they run on the Delaware River, and they get an estimate of total number produced. Well, when you look at 1989, you see that the number in gray are what could have survived if they hadn't been killed by Salem, according to the calculations I did. You have to make assumptions in this analysis, but it's a reasonable approach. And these are the actual number that actually survived in the dark gray. So this proportion killed is highly variable. You see in 93, there was an immense proportion of the potential striped bass that year that were killed, but other years there was little or none. And then we get into 1989, the majority of potential fish were killed. By 2002, over half were killed. So we're talking about millions of fish here in the survivors each year, pretty much. So what this tells us is, on average, the Salem reactor kills about 1/3 of the potential production of striped bass in the Delaware River. That is very significant because there are only 3 major spawning stocks of striped bass on the Atlantic coast: the Hudson River stock, the Delaware River stock, and the Chesapeake Bay stocks. And the Delaware River stock is estimated to produce about 20% of all the striped bass in the Atlantic Ocean. So if you're killing off 1/3 of them, then you're potentially killing like 10% of the potential total abundance of striped bass in the Atlantic Ocean. That's the way it works out. So it is a significant impact for fishery managers. And next slide, last slide. I think I've covered pretty much of this. But one other thing is that striped bass have a tendency to produce dominant year classes. Every few years or so many years, they'll produce a very large year class, and that carries the fishery for several years. Well, it looks like what Salem is doing, when the Delaware River stock is trying to produce one of those, Salem is killing off a large majority of those potential members of that dominant year class. So it's no longer a dominant year class. And I just want to mention, PSE&G has done comparable analysis to mine, and it's corroborated these findings. Okay, that's all I have. Just giving you a touch of couple of the important species. Now, if we could reduce the intake volume of Salem, we would reduce the fish kill in Salem. And for example, if cooling towers were retrofitted into the Salem plants, as the Delaware Riverkeeper Network seeks, that would reduce the intake volume by 95% and would reduce the intake of fish by 95%. Financial analysis shows that these large corporations that own the plants could definitely afford this. And unfortunately, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection has denied this statement of fact about the 95% reduction in a nonsensical and false statement in its most recent permit for Salem. It's hard to believe what they wrote, but they're totally incorrect about it. So that's all I can say about that at this point, and I want to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Des. So we're going to go into Q&A after I give a brief update on the MACH2 Hydrogen Hub. The MACH2, or the Mid-Atlantic Hydrogen Hub, is a hub that's targeting the Delaware River watershed. And it includes Delaware, South and Central New Jersey, and also Southeastern Pennsylvania. We have a slide at the very end of the show of our webinar here tonight that shows you where you can go to sign up to become involved, because we have a network of groups that have pledged to stop MACH2. And this Mid-Atlantic Hydrogen Hub is proposed. It's not funded yet. And we believe that we have a unique moment right now to be able to stop that, and we will continue no matter whether it gets funded or not. So the important announcement that we heard yesterday from MACH2 was that they expect in September to announce whether or not, well, for the Department of Energy to announce whether or not they get their funding, and they may get partial funding, which is what they've been doing with the other hydrogen hubs. So we have some information, and we have links that are going into the chat that show you where you can get more based on what MACH2 has posted and what we found through Freedom of Information Acts. But the information is shifting, as was mentioned by Dr. Kahn, and it's also scant and imprecise. And I'll go through three aspects of MACH2 that kind of organizes how to look at this. One is production, the other is transport, and the other is end use. So for the production, nuclear is going, according to MACH2, be a source of energy to produce hydrogen. We heard about that here tonight. I would just like to point out that the Salem Hope Creek plants, as Des Kahn mentioned, are probably going to be the sources that they expect. And as Dr. Makhijani said, that means that they're going to be pulling from the grid to either replace that with dirty energy, or if they don't have additionality. So we are opposed to the use of nuclear for MACH2. And there are a lot of issues that we didn't even touch on tonight because there's so much to cover, but one of them is nuclear waste. And at the end of Dr. Makhijani's talk, he mentioned, all of the life cycle impacts, such as mining, the impact to environmental justice, communities throughout the United States, particularly Native American communities, where the waste is going as well. So the nuclear is a major source that we focused on tonight, but they also mention a renewable natural gas or biogas with carbon capture that would use steam methane reforming. They talk about refinery gray water, also methane and frac gas is a possibility, and also RNG, as mentioned at the top, and wind and or solar. So all of these sources may end up being sources. We don't know exactly, and we probably won't know till their new application or their new documents have been released when we get further Freedom of Information Act requests, which we post on our website, or when they announce funding in the fall. So for transport, major pipeline network is what they're promoting from Delaware, from the PPF refinery, all the way up to Philadelphia. And also some of these pipelines would go under the river to New Jersey. And some would use existing pipeline infrastructure, some would use existing easements, but we don't know exactly. That information is redacted from documents that we have received. They also say they're going to be building 6 shorter pipelines. Some of these are greenfields, and just recently it was revealed that there's some mystery pipeline, we don't know what for, that is planned to be built a new pipeline to the incinerator in Chester as part of the MACH2 project. And they had promised to Chester that there would not be any involvement with the incinerator there, the trash to steam plant there. And then they would also use truck transportation along the I-95 corridor and other road networks. They also mentioned railroads and ports. We don't know exactly how they would be involved, but they are mentioned. So for production and storage sites, those locations are Philadelphia. They plan to produce hydrogen at PGW sites. Also Delaware City, Delaware, that's the PBF refinery. At the Salem Hope Creek sites and also the Oyster Creek site, they expect to produce hydrogen. And then in Paulsboro, New Jersey, it's unclear exactly what refinery, but at a refinery. And then also the Monroe refinery at Marcus and Chester area wants to produce hydrogen there. And they also talk about the Hilco site, and I'll talk about that in a second, in Philadelphia as an end use and perhaps a storage site as well. Also, they would store it along the truck and rail transport routes. They would store it at terminals, and they have to store it at end use locations in order to use it. And examples of that would be SEPTA, the public transit system in Philadelphia, also DART, which is the Delaware public transit system, and New Jersey Transit is also mentioned in our most recent documents as a part of MACH2 to use hydrogen as an end use. So hydrogen pollution, I want to point out here, hydrogen does pollute, and hydrogen is a false solution because it does not address the climate crisis. But in terms of pollution, when you burn hydrogen, you do release nitrogen oxides. And of course, that has devastating health impacts for communities, and it also is a precursor to smog. Probably you have noticed if you're on the Pennsylvania DEP listserv that today is a code orange day in Philadelphia. And that's because we do not meet the federal clean air standards for ozone. And we meet these code orange thresholds many times during the year, and we've met them already many times this season. And if we have any more nitrogen oxide into our atmosphere, we're going to be making our problem for our communities in terms of dirty air worse. So they also plan to use these the hydrogen at power plants. They use it according to their documents in some different types of heating. And then they are also going to be using it at warehouses, presumably someplace like Hilco, and also for logistics at terminals. And I would just like to point out that at this point, there are no what they call hard to abate end uses listed in MACH2, such as steel making. And so just to wrap up here, hydrogen is an indirect greenhouse gas. It extends the life of methane in the atmosphere. So it actually, as Dr. Makhijani said, undermines our goal of what these hydrogen hubs are supposed to be. It undermines our ability to address the climate crisis and will actually be making it worse because we will have more greenhouse gases than we do now if they move ahead with these hydrogen hubs as planned. And finally, the biggest issue here that according to the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations and MACH2 is that this is going to be different, these hubs. They're going to be involving communities. They're going to engage communities. And they're supposed to be having these community engagement plans. We haven't seen them yet. They've been kept behind closed doors. They've not been disclosed. They were supposed to give a draft into the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. They have not shared that draft with the public. But what we do know is no communities have been consulted before the maps were drawn up and these 20 sites and projects were put together to ask them whether or not they wanted to be a host community, to listen to the community and find out what the conditions are. And we know that most of these communities, and I would say, you know, if you look at the maps, it's really 99% of the communities that will be affected are currently environmental justice communities that are already overburdened with environmental insults. So we're laying on top of those communities the infrastructure, the production, and the end uses of these hydrogen projects that they're planning for MACH2. And that is absolutely unjust. We also do not have any transparency from MACH2 or OSED. We get little bits of information. We have to fight for them for many of our organizations filing Freedom of Information Act request or right to know request or open records request with the states. And what we've managed to scrap together, we're sharing. There's a link to our website where we have a page on this, and we put the information up there as we get it. And now I'm going to turn it back to Annika, and she and I are going to moderate the Q&A. And please, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A. And Dr. Kahn and Dr. Makhijani will respond, or if there's something for me, I'll be happy to respond too. So Annika, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, so I will try to read these, and if I misquote anything, or if anybody thinks the question is best for you, feel free. So the first question we have is that it's a question and a statement. It doesn't make sense to take energy away from the grid. Isn't increasing fossil fuel power plants also increasing emissions?
Yeah, I mean, I gave the numbers on that there in my slides. That's absolutely right. I don't think I need to elaborate more yet. It would make things worse.
Great. Okay. And then the next one is a simple answer, which is perfect. The next one is explain, and this might be for you again, Arjun. Explain the DOE clean standard of 4 kilograms per CO2 EQ per kilogram hydrogen. How can DOE say that hydrogen is clean if it allows greenhouse gases CO2?
Yeah. So it's a relative term, not an absolute term. So that's why they say some emissions. It's in two parts, actually. Half of that, 2 kilograms, would be allowed at the site of production. So like if you're producing from natural gas and you capture the CO2, this is the theory, right? You could have some emissions of CO2, but you would capture most of the CO2. Upstream, it takes upstream emissions of natural gas leaks and so on into account, not adequately, in my opinion. But that's a detail covered in my book. And principle, it takes upstream emissions into account properly. And you are allowed to. So if you compare it to like burning natural gas using the same criteria, 20-year warming potential, the leak rates that have been in the peer-reviewed literature for some time, burning natural gas would be 80, 90, 100 per million BTU kilograms of CO2 equivalent per million BTU. Burning hydrogen or using hydrogen, producing hydrogen, 1 million BTU would be 30, 35 if you're emitting 4 kilograms equivalent per kilogram hydrogen. So kilogram hydrogen is about equal to a gallon of gasoline in energy terms. So you need about 8 or 9 of them to make 1 million BTU. So that's the math. Now, the Department of Treasury regulations would reward hydrogen production that has lower emissions. That's part of this whole additionality deal you have to have, so on. So 4 kilograms is a relative thing. The main sort of asterisk on that is, how are you going to use the hydrogen? So if you use the hydrogen in a way that's as the same as natural gas, burning it in a turbine, those would be the numbers. If you use it less efficiently, then you would be worse than what I just said. But if you use it much more efficiently, which would be the case with steel, so steel, you'd be displacing coal and coke. Hydrogen is much more efficient in steel production. So then you're actually doing much better because you have some emissions producing hydrogen, but you're reducing the overall emissions per ton of end product by a lot more than it would seem. So the answer is yes, 4 kilograms is an upper limit for clean hydrogen. It does have some technical merit on the face of it if you're looking to reduce. But the main thing is, as Tracy has said, the hydrogen uses currently that would be beneficial are very limited, mostly replacing natural gas and ammonia production, maybe some steel production, maybe some chemical production. That's the short term, I would say, up to the next 10 years with some exceptions. And I won't go into the exceptions. You can read my book. Or the
Thank
book I
you.
did with Tom.
Thank you, Arjun. I just want to add, Arjun mentioned the tax credit program, and just want people to know that there was a comment period open to the public on what was proposed to be what they call the three pillars, or one of them was additionality. That would be sort of what they called guardrails for who would receive the tax credits. And there has been huge pushback against the strict standards that are in that proposed 45V tax credit program. And MACH2, along with all of the other hydrogen hubs, submitted a letter saying that they wanted these rules relaxed. And I think, you know, one way to put that is they want to reduce or make less strong the standards in the 45V in order to release more carbon. That's basically what they want to do. And they want to, the reason that they say they want to do that is because they want to make more money. Basically, they want to be financially solvent. So there right now are Senator Casey, Senator Fetterman, and others have most recently sent a letter also attacking the 45V standards. So it's an ongoing battle, and within the coming weeks or months, there will be a decision coming out of the Department of Treasury, the IRS, about how the 45V will actually play out. That's all I wanted to add about 45V. Some people know this, and we talked about it last time, but want to make sure everyone knows it's up in the air, and a lot of politicians and hydrogen hubs are fighting the strict standards.
Awesome. And so this next question is specifically for Dr. Kahn. Dr. Kahn, you mentioned that PSENG produced the report about the mass killings of the bay anchovies. What actions did they take, and did they address any of the concerns you raised?
No, they just report it as they're required to do. And they wouldn't so much possibly do something to reduce that as hopefully the state of New Jersey DEP and the Riverkeeper Network suggests that they require these plants to retrofit cooling towers, which would reduce the mortality by 95%. But the plant, the utility, do not do anything. They just report these numbers killed.
Yeah, and I would just add that right now, Delaware Riverkeeper Network is in the middle of an administrative appeal for the 2016 NPDES permit for the Salem plants. So we just had an argument on that in court. If we prevail, we will be able to move through an administrative hearing process. If we don't prevail with our motions, we will be going to court. And that this has been an ongoing fight for our organization for the last 20 years. We have opposed every single permit and have lost all along the way, with DEP making the most horrible decision that Desmond Kahn described as being, you know, unsupportable and illogical. But also want to point out that we didn't have time to focus on nuclear waste and all of the other life cycle issues tonight related to nuclear. And there are many, many issues related to nuclear energy that many people are concerned about. And that also, no matter whether they were using Hope Creek or Salem, Delaware Riverkeeper Network would still be opposed to the use of nuclear for MACH2.
I do have to say something about that. And I mentioned this to you in an email. So long as you're producing the power, you're going to have the waste. Nuclear waste is a big problem. I'm on record about that. It's a giant issue, spent fuel and so many other kinds of waste, the uranium waste. Actually, you reminded me of this call I was writing about nuclear waste. And that's why I forgot that it was already 3:30. So long as the plant is operating at a certain capacity factor, it's going to produce a certain amount of waste. The problem with diverting it for hydrogen is you're increasing CO2 emissions. Now, shutting down the nuclear power plants, of course, as I have advocated, we should all be doing it with renewable energy, and 100% is possible. I've written a much more updated report than Carbon Free, Nuclear Free and I can send you that link. It's much more possible now than it was 20 years ago, 15, 17 years ago when I first wrote about it, because solar and wind are so much cheaper. And we have battery storage that's much more feasible than it was back then. Efficiency should always be the starting point. So basically, by diverting nuclear energy, you're increasing CO2. By producing nuclear energy, of course, you're making a big mess in many different places. Yeah, just to be clear about that in public argument, so you're not being shut down on a wrong, on a.
Could I make a comment here about the nuclear waste at Salem in particular? I wonder what they're going to do with that nuclear waste when the ocean, if and when the Atlantic Ocean rises high enough that it will overtop the Salem site.
Well,
What's gonna
Dr.
happen?
Kahn, all of these questions should have been examined when the licenses for like Salem and Hope Creek, Turkey Point in Florida, so many places, Antarctica is melting fast. We've had the ocean like in Utah before, right? That's where that has happened in the geologic past. So, but the NRC doesn't pay attention to these things. And now, of course, instead of kind of phasing out nuclear, we're trying to subsidizing the startup of shutdown plants, going backwards. It's a fairly big topic. I would love to, if you have a webinar on nuclear energy, we can go into all of this stuff. That's just one of the problems with nuclear waste. The other problem, if I might mention, that I am very preoccupied with is, these plants are going to shut down one day. 60 years, 80 years, whatever, they're going to get old and to be too costly to operate, and they're going to shut down. Once they're not making money, storing waste on site for a long period of time, there won't be money for it. The attention of the establishments get diverted. Today, it's very difficult to steal the spent fuel because it's very radioactive, external radiation. It'll kill you if you handle it. There's about 30 bombs worth of plutonium made by every nuclear reactor that's about the size of Salem and Hope Creek, each one of those three. So you're making about 100 nuclear bombs worth of plutonium, but it's mixed in with all the waste. After 200 years, that external radiation barrier will kill you if you try to steal it. It's pretty much gone. And so stealing it and extracting the plutonium for making bombs, today we have more separated plutonium in the civilian sector that's not being used as a fuel in the world than in all the nuclear bombs in the world put together. And so, and nobody's paying attention to all of these, it's just details, it's just, 300 metric tons of plutonium. Yeah. So, I mean, these are just giant issues, and that should be one of the big ones, but we're not paying attention.
Right. And that's why we don't consider what they call MACH2 calls a green hydrogen hub. We do not consider MACH2 to be clean. It's not clean. It's not green.
Yeah,
and
I agree. Nuclear energy is not clean. Yeah, it's the propaganda that it's clean. Ask the Navajos, or the Congolese for that matter.
I think this might be a good question that everybody then can partake in, because we're getting kind of different. I'll combine a bunch of different questions that I'm getting, which is, that we're hearing that hydrogen is kind of the Swiss Army knife to combating the climate crisis. And so why are groups not okay with it being proposed a solution? Why is even a green hydrogen hub like really not green as we're being told? So I feel like everybody kind of has different pieces to that puzzle. If everybody wants to do that.
So Anika, did I pronounce your name correctly?
Yeah.
Anika, that question's in two parts. If you make green hydrogen with new, say, solar power plant, or if you make hydrogen with the renewable electricity that's being thrown away in Texas and California, you could probably make about 100,000 tons of hydrogen that way, instead of basically shutting down the wind power plant when there's too much electricity. That's going on right now in just Texas and California, pretty much. If you use that hydrogen to make steel and displace coal, you're saving workers' lungs, you're saving greenhouse gases, you're doing something good and not really making extra emissions. So there are, in the long term, in my assessment, when we have 60, 70, 80% wind, you're going to have lots of surpluses that will throw away. You should find good uses for that. Making some hydrogen with it for peaking generation and fuel cells in 2040 may be a pretty good idea. Today, it's a really bad idea. So but the number of uses of hydrogen that are good and have low opportunity costs are few. Perhaps very long distance, multi-shift trucking, steel production, ammonia production. Of course, we should be going to organic fertilizers, right? But that's a whole different question. Changing agriculture is a, you know, at least as big a beast as the energy transition. And so hydrogen in itself, in my estimation, Tom Hersbach, in my estimation, the amount of hydrogen that could be useful is maybe 40% of what the DOE and the hydrogen buffs say in the long term. In the short term, it's less than that, quite a bit less than that. In the short term, there are not many uses, mainly getting rid of natural gas to produce ammonia, I would say.
Yeah, and I would just add that you know, the reason that we're opposed to MACH2 and we're working to stop it is because we do not believe that the investment that's being made by the federal government is an investment that will attack climate change and address our climate problems, and it will actually make it worse. It takes more energy to produce hydrogen, then you end up with energy that's useful at the end. And it also produces pollution. And the safety and hazard issues we have talked about on other webinars, but all of the issues associated with the production, transport, storage, and end use of hydrogen are being laid on top of our already overburdened communities. So we have to stop MACH2. It does not plan to produce steel or ammonia. Its end uses are power plants and heating, and you know, SEPTA has buses. They're going to be running through the streets of Philadelphia and trucks coming up, you know, hundreds of miles away, snaking through the neighborhoods of Philadelphia to deliver this hydrogen to these fuel cell buses. And, you know, all of this is just insanity when you look at the outsized investment that our federal government is making, $7 billion in these hydrogen hubs. According to our last webinar, our experts from IEFA estimated $100 billion is what the three tax credit programs are going to be giving to industries in order to produce hydrogen. So we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. Just think what we could do with that if we were putting that investment into renewables and directly electrifying with those renewables. And that's what we want to do. We want efficiency first. Dr. Makhijani said that. And we want cleanliness first, and we want our communities not to be overburdened. So, you know, we know that hydrogen is an indirect greenhouse gas. We know that it is actually more powerful than what's being used now. And we've heard that from Dr. Makhijani. We've heard it from other experts on these webinars. So let's get going with what we should be doing through our tax money and our programs through the Infrastructure Act. Let's go to renewables. So Desmond, I want to give you the last minute here because we're right at 7:30, and then we're going to talk about how people can get involved. But did you want to add anything to that question that Annika threw out?
I mean, what I dealt with was the fisheries impact and the ecological impact of the Salem reactor. And I will say, not all reactors have the same impact because the newer ones like Hope Creek have cooling towers. But Salem is an anachronism. It should be updated. And, you know, I've been working on the fisheries of the Delaware estuary and the Atlantic Ocean for several decades, and we need the productivity from those fish populations. It's an economic issue for people in the that are water oriented and recreation oriented through the water, the ecosystem there, and the fact that these profit-making companies are allowed to wage this kind of destruction is just, I just think it's a travesty. So hopefully somebody will see the light, but we've had a little trouble so far.
Thank you, Dr. Kahn. Delaware Riverkeeper Network calls Salem the largest predator in the bay.
Oh, yeah.
And that is definitely what it is. And just so people know, the Salem units and Hope Creek just reapplied within the last year to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to have their life extended. So they want to go beyond what their current life is supposed to be according to the NRC. So we're very worried about this, and we'll keep fighting. But
yeah, Tracy, if I might say, that's the point at which this sea level rise that Dr. Kahn mentioned in the license hearings should be brought up. You probably already planned it, but I just wanted to say that.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Makhijani. Okay, so we're going to move on now to our last slide, Peter. We have petitions that you can sign, and we just launched a petition this week when we had an action protesting the MACH2 SEPTA meetup that they had in Philadelphia yesterday. And that petition is to stop the SEPTA hydrogen bus project. That's the link to that. Also, we have Action Network set up for, it's an unbranded site for all of our organizations that are working together in a network to stop MACH2. And if you want to get involved, if you want to be, engaged in things that are happening, sign up right there. There's a little thing where you, up in the right-hand corner, that says, I want to get involved. And that way we'll keep in touch with you, and we'll tell you when actions are happening and different events are happening, and you can be involved in a deeper way. Also, if you have an organization that would like to join our MACH2 exchange, we meet bi-weekly and sometimes weekly depending on our subcommittees. So we're very active, and there's a lot going on. We have organizations from Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, so all over, and we want to expand even broader from the groups that we already have engaged. So please check out our webpage. We put information up there as things come along. And we also want to say a special thank you to everybody joining here tonight. We believe that we can stop MACH2, and we believe that we can do that through the science and through the technical experts that are explaining to us what's wrong with MACH2. They're not planning to do what they're saying to do. They're saying they're going to do. What the effect is going to be of MACH2 and the other hydrogen hubs, as far as we can tell, is to actually make our climate problems worse and to pollute our air and harm our communities. So we're fighting it, and we ask you and invite you to join with us on that. And finally, I'd like to give a special thank you to Dr. Arjun Makhijani and to Dr. Desmond Kahn for your excellent presentation here tonight. I've learned a lot, and I see notes in the chat. People have learned a lot, so thank you very much. We greatly appreciate your joining and giving your time here tonight.